thing. All right. So today we have the great pleasure of welcoming Ellen Wohl for a Landscapes Live seminar. And I will not spend too much time introducing her because I think that given her number of awards and storied career, if you start a little bit, suddenly the introduction gets quite long. But since Ellen will focus on her research, I would just like to highlight the fact that right now she's working, and she has been working for many years, at the Warner College of Natural Resources, which is part of the Colorado State University. And this, beyond her pure academic research career, she wrote several books for non-academic audiences. And one of the particularities of her work is to have this really healthy link between the scientific research on the one side and the application of that knowledge in, for example, river restoration, and this constant exchange with the communities that use the knowledge that we create. Maybe focusing just on one award, because this is one I remember personally. In 2018, Ellen was the first woman to receive the G.K. Gilbert Award at AGU. And I remember that you mentioned the importance of fairy godparents in that talk. And I think that this was really a beautiful thing to always keep in mind. And that stayed with me, this idea that anyone can be a fairy godparent, and just being kind to someone else, helping along, is part of building this greater community. And I think that's, you exemplified that in many ways in your career. I was counting the number of students that went through your group, and I could count at least 47 PhD and master's students on the Warner College Natural Resource website. I suppose that a few of them are online right now. And so in the light of that, that's great, community and family, we'd like to welcome you, and we look forward to hearing you talk about river science.
Thank you very much, Luca. That was a very gracious introduction. And I should say one of my grad students a few years ago coined the term flammily for fluvial family. So yes, I think some of the fluvial, see, it's a tongue twister, but some of the flammily are online. But to get started with the talk, I'm going to be talking about some of the research that I and my grad students have done over the past more than a decade now. And what I'd really like to emphasize in this is the potential for our community of geomorphologists and hydrologists to engage with the communities that are very concerned about climate warming, and particularly about the potential for carbon sequestration. So let's see if we can, I'm just seeing if I can, there we go. Some of the challenges we all face while we were waiting to get started this morning, Luca and Boris and I were chatting about the current weather in our respective locations and the trends of things that are shaping up, like drought in France. Global challenge of climate change, climate warming, and how that's going to affect different regions. And then additional challenges, how can we minimize, or not minimize, but mitigate some of the enormous amounts of carbon that we're pumping into the atmosphere through various activities. Big challenges around water resources, consumptive water use for various purposes, but also environmental needs for water, and certainly significant challenges around trying to preserve river ecosystems, as opposed to just having rivers that are kind of glorified canals and take whatever water we have downstream. And all of this can be examined in the context of resilience, a word that is very widely used now in a variety of different contexts, and that I'm going to use in this talk. So one way to look at it would be to think of changing climate. There's more of us. Population growth rates are starting to decline, but they're still increasing. We all want more resources. And at the same time, we're trying to preserve some of these natural ecosystems, including rivers. So my only slightly silly take on this is, Edvard Munch's The Scream. It's a challenging and a scary situation that we all face. So I want to look at that from the context of river ecosystems and river corridors. And I'm going to use the phrase river corridor because when most of us say river, or when most of us hear river, we think of channel, and that's all. But a river corridor, using that phrase, really acknowledges explicitly the fact that a channel occurs in a context that includes the adjacent floodplains and the underlying hyporheic zone. And this particular diagram from a paper on river corridor science a few years ago makes very explicit the fact that nothing moves in a straight line downstream, unless maybe it's a fish with a strong purpose. Water, solutes, mineral sediment, particulate organic matter, all of those materials move downstream episodically. There are periods of storage, even if it's very transient storage. And in a natural, fully functioning river corridor, there's a lot of lateral exchange with the floodplain and a lot of vertical exchange with both the hyporheic zone, the groundwater, and for some materials, the atmosphere. So I think if we say river corridor, it really helps to emphasize these interactions, both between physical process and form, which is what most of us focus on, but also biota, both in the channel and in the riparian zone, biogeochemical reactions. And it also helps to really emphasize those interactions between what you could think of as the three geomorphic or hydrologic components of the river corridor. So when I think about river corridors, it's often at the reach scale, where a reach can be a few meters in length if you're looking at a small, say, a first order headwater stream, or it can be tens of kilometers in length if you're looking at a large river. But I define a reach as a length of river corridor that has consistent valley and channel geometry. So we can all think of rivers. One of the ones I like to use, particularly for a European audience, is the Danube. It goes downstream, alternating between big alluvial basins like Vienna or Linz or Budapest, and then goes through very narrow canyons in between. So those are distinct reaches. And in the mountain rivers that I tend to work on in Colorado, there are analogous downstream alternations between fairly wide, low gradient reaches, although they're only 100 meters wide, and then steep, narrow portions in between. So thinking of these river corridors, I usually conceptualize them as being created and maintained by fluxes that can be continuous or discrete in time and space. And those fluxes are occurring in what I think of as a geomorphic context. That determines the adjustment. In the photo that you're looking at here, this is an long abandoned beaver pond that's the dam is completely grown over. It's at the right in this photo, and the active channel is at the other side of the valley. It doesn't show up here. But there's this past history that's recorded in the individual components of this portion of the river corridor. So those interactions between the flux and the context result in spatial heterogeneity, which I'm just defining as the patchiness. Do you have a single uniform surface cover or geomorphic, let's say stratigraphy and topography in the corridor, or do you have patches like this abandoned beaver pond? Certainly, it strongly influences that three-dimensional connectivity and resilience, which I'm describing as the ability to respond to disturbance. And that can be a natural disturbance like a flood or a drought or a wildfire, or a human-induced disturbance, but a resilient system returns to pre-disturbance conditions relatively quickly. And then most of you are probably familiar with the idea of ecological integrity. It's the ability of an ecosystem to support a native community of organisms. Geomorphic or physical integrity is a little less widely known, but it's the idea that the system has the ability to adjust to changes in flux. And if you think about the worst case scenario of an urban river, it's a concrete trench. There's no adjustment capability there. If you get more water, it just moves downstream faster. There's no erosion or deposition or adjustment. So a fully functional natural river corridor has more geomorphic integrity in that if the energy coming in, such as during a flood, increases, then there will be corresponding or compensating erosion and deposition and adjustments of the channel form. And I'm going to look at all of this in the context of organic carbon flux and storage. So just to sort of schematically illustrate what I was just saying, all rivers have fluxes of water and sediment. And historically, rivers in forested river corridors had far more large wood than they do at present. So this was another major regime or flux. They interact with that valley geometry, which is governed by things like, are you in the headwaters or in the lowlands? How much lateral space is there in the river corridor for the channel to adjust? So the photos here, the upper right is a wide, low gradient channel in an alluvial plain. The photo on the right is the Colorado River in the narrowest part of Grand Canyon, very tightly constrained. So what are the spatial limits, the erosional resistance of those boundaries, and how stable is the base level downstream? All of those create this context. And I put human influence in here because we don't usually change valley geometry, but we do change how the river corridor interacts within that existing valley geometry. And you can think of artificial levees, flow regulation, channel engineering of various kinds. Those influence adjustments in that context. So the fluxes and context then result in these series of characteristics that I mentioned earlier, and they're just some illustrations of those on the lower part here. So coming back to the carbon cycle, when people first started to, or in the scientific community, first started to look at the global carbon cycle, they conceptualized it as basically two biologically active boxes. There's carbon in the terrestrial environment, carbon in the oceans. They're connected through gas exchanges with the atmosphere and through transport of carbon from the land to the ocean. And of course, that arrow between the land and the ocean reflects primarily rivers. And subsequent work began to look more at rivers. That indicated that rivers are very important transporters of carbon coming out of the terrestrial environment, mainly soils and vegetation, to the ocean. But the early numerical and conceptual models just treated rivers as neutral pipes. It was literally called the neutral pipe hypothesis. So things go into the river, they go down to the ocean, end of story. We don't have to worry about it. So we could be a little bit more explicit in those three boxes. I've made soil in capital letters because, of course, that's the largest single terrestrial source of or stock of carbon. And rivers are in parentheses indicating that neutral pipe. Mostly stream ecologists and biogeochemists started to question whether rivers were really neutral pipes. And there's a nice example here from a synthesis paper in 2007. They said, well, actually, there's a lot of exchange between the atmosphere and the river directly. And there are different things that control that. It's everything from the surface area of the river to water temperature, the biological activity, the degree of turbulence and dissolved oxygen in the river. But they said it's a little too simplistic to call the rivers neutral pipes. Let's call them active pipes. And again, it was focusing on gas exchange. Finally, our community, the geomorphologists and the earth scientists, started to get more involved and said, oh, and by the way, there's also quite a lot of carbon that can be stored, especially in the floodplains. And this work really started in Europe, in the Danube and the Rhine. People like Hoffman and Sirjaks started to look at some of these reservoirs and said, oh, there's a lot of carbon in these floodplains. And I got very interested in that about a decade ago and started looking at the mountain rivers in Colorado and said, yeah, there's a lot of carbon in these floodplains. So now when I look at a photo like this is the Yukon River in the Yukon Flats region in the interior of Alaska. It's a large, completely natural river, no timber harvest here, no flow regulation, no channel engineering. It moves back and forth across that floodplain, and you can see in the foreground in this image, there's a lot of spatial heterogeneity and there's a lot of standing water. It's actually a very dry region, but it's underlain by permafrost. So whatever water is there doesn't infiltrate. So besides hosting a very happy, conservatively, 1 billion mosquitoes, it's a really good carbon sink because you have a lot of saturated soils and reducing environments. And many of the floodplains that we have dried out, we being people, during the last 2 centuries, look more like this historically. So let's go back to thinking about it at the global scale. We know that what comes into rivers is more than what gets to the oceans. So there are other things happening on the way, and you're going to see wide ranges in all these numbers. A petagram is a very large quantity. So anywhere from 1.1 to 5.1 petagrams of carbon a year coming off terrestrial environments going into the freshwater network, something like 1.2 going to the atmosphere, something like 0.9 going to the oceans, and then a huge range down here that this is coming from different papers, and it partly depends on whether they do or do not include floodplains, whether they include natural lakes, artificial reservoirs, so you get a huge range. But the point is that within the last decade, I think earth scientists have shown that there's actually a lot of carbon coming from terrestrial environments that goes back into sedimentary environments, particularly along those not so neutral pipes of rivers. So I'm going to focus on this part in the rest of the talk. And we know that river corridors are sites for carbon going back into the atmosphere through photosynthesis. And I say terrestrial here, referring to the riparian zone. So floodplain vegetation, aquatic vegetation in the channel. There's a lot that's going downstream in the form of the very largest material, such as the large wood you see here, particulate organic carbon, dissolved organic carbon, but that's going eventually down to the oceans. But there's also storage of carbon, and it is really widely varying lengths of time, from a few hours, if it's particulate organic carbon in a backwater of a small river, to several thousand years in the soils of the largest rivers and their floodplains, particularly the parts of the floodplain that are distal from the channel. So one of my PhD students, former PhD students, Nick Sutphin, did a synthesis of what had been published up to that time in 2016. And the large numbers that you see in these boxes represent studies from all over the world. So they're all different types of rivers, very different environments. But what you see here is that in some river corridors, the living riparian vegetation is a very important stock, and particularly in the tropics, if they have intact rainforest. In most rivers, the living biota in the channel is pretty small. It's not a very large reservoir of carbon. In some conditions, there's a lot of carbon stored in the downed dead wood, and in many river corridors, there's a lot stored in floodplain soils. So I've highlighted these two in red because I'm going to focus on these for the rest of the talk. Let me use a mountain stream in Colorado just to the west of me as an example. So this is North St. Vrain Creek, about 400 square kilometers. You're looking at a map of reach scale gradient. The red are the very high gradient systems. And it's not a simple, everything at the headwaters is red. You notice there's, where I've got the arrow moving here, the cursor, there's a large green reach. There are green and yellow reaches scattered throughout here. This reflects the geologic controls and geologic history in this particular watershed. As you go downstream in any of these channels, it tends to alternate between steep, narrow, very laterally confined reaches and wide, low gradient reaches. And those reflect largely geologic characteristics. This is mostly the same lithology underlying this catchment, but there are dramatic differences in the joint density. So where the bedrock joints or fractures are more widely spaced, you have more resistant rock, and you have some of these red or steep reaches. There's really no floodplain there. The valley walls come right down to the active channel. And then in contrast, either where there's a greater fracture density or sometimes as a function of glacial history, you have these wide, low gradient reaches. So in this case, the lower photo, the flow is going from right to left. The Pleistocene terminal moraine is just downstream out of the photo here. So this would be a very wide, low gradient reach. It's also been strongly modified by beavers. This is a very active reach with several active beaver colonies. So when I think about the processes operating in these mountain streams, I start with that valley context, but then I also think about what I've called the biotic drivers, the large wood accumulations and the beaver and the dams that they're building. And the large wood is important because it creates these channel spanning log jams. And in this photo, this is on one of the tributaries of North St. Vrain. You can see a lot of particulate organic matter and partially buried large wood stored in this log jam. So the storage time in the active channel is typically shorter than it is in the floodplain. But one of the things that stream ecologists have shown very nicely is that if you store this coarse particulate organic matter, even for a matter of hours, that dramatically increases the availability of it for microbes and for macroinvertebrates. So you start to take up some of the nutrients and some of the carbon that's stored in there and put it into living tissue. So to put this more conceptually or schematically, I think about the valley geometry and how it interacts with the disturbance regime. So floods, and in this particular catchment, wildfires are very important. How that influences river corridor morphology, and that in turn influences large wood dynamics. Those channel spanning log jams are by far the most abundant in the wide, low gradient reaches, and they tend to have longer residence times there. And then how that affects the storage and transport and transformation of organic carbon, and ultimately the stock in the river corridor. And when I use the term stock, that's referring to how much carbon is stored in different pools. So it can be large wood or soils, but it's usually expressed in something like megagrams of carbon per hectare. So looking at the North St. Vrain in a different context, this is mostly coming from Nick Sutphin's dissertation work. This is a Google Earth view looking at the upper half of the catchment. So it's the alpine that you can see in the background there. There's minimal carbon storage up there in this semi-arid environment. And then the subalpine and the beaver meadow that I was showing you is at the lower part of this photo. You can see the lateral moraines very nicely on either side of it. So Nick took a lot of sediment samples and did a lot of carbon analyses and radiocarbon analyses here. And he found these are average values over many sites, something like 150 megagrams of carbon per hectare in the laterally confined reaches, those steep, narrow sections. As you go to the wide, lower gradient sections where there's more floodplain, you have both more surface area in the floodplain, so there's more alluvium, more surface area, more thickness. There's also a greater concentration of carbon per unit mass of soil. So you have sort of the triple whammy: greater surface area, greater depth, which creates greater volume, and then greater concentration. So you've got something that's almost double the carbon stored in those. In the beaver meadow, it's more than double. The key for a lot of these wide, low gradient reaches is that you have a very high water table, and characteristics like channel spanning log jams and beaver dams that create obstructions in the channel, facilitate overbank flow, hyporheic exchange. They tend to promote that high water table. So you have saturated, reducing conditions. So any carbon that comes into these floodplains in the form of plant litter, for example, particulate organic matter, is less likely to be microbially processed and more likely to be stored. And then you get to some of the other unconfined, laterally unconfined areas that just have a single channel rather than an anastomosing channel. They're, again, if you remember, those wide, low gradient sections have a high density of bedrock fractures, so there's more groundwater inflow. They are very wet floodplains, and they have what's almost peat in portions of them, so very high carbon content. The pooled mean radiocarbon age, or average turnover time for these floodplains, something like 1,500 years before present, so 1,500 years. And the uplands have much lower carbon. And that value of 150 megagrams of carbon per hectare is including the vegetation. But these are conifer forests. They have very thin soils. There's just not a lot of carbon stored in the adjacent uplands. If we look at the lower half of the mountain portion of the basin, so this is in what's called the Methane zone, it's got a very different disturbance regime. If you can see the light streaks that I'm pointing out with the cursor here, in 2013, we had a very large flood, rainfall-generated convective storm that mostly affected the lower part of this basin and adjacent watersheds. So lots of landsliding, a lot of erosion and very coarse sediment deposition on the floodplain. So the wildfires that can often be associated with that type of landslide and flood have a recurrence interval that's something like 40 to 100 years in this part of the catchment. In the upper catchment, it's more like 400 years. The 2013 flood was not associated with a fire, but between fires and convective storms, there's a much more frequent disturbance regime in this lower part of the catchment. And that equates to smaller values of carbon storage. You're periodically flushing the stored carbon. Historically, it would have gone into alluvial fans at the mountain front. Now it goes into this artificial reservoir here of Button Rock Dam. And the turnover time is much shorter, less than half of what you see in the subalpine zone. So what I take from this is partly that at the reach scale, those wide, low gradient versus narrow, steep sections make a difference in where the carbon is stored, but also at the watershed scale, if you have differences in disturbance regime, whether that's anthropogenic, maybe there's a history of timber harvest, for example, or associated with elevational contrasts and hydroclimatology, as in this case, it translates to very different levels of carbon storage. And again, the upland carbon storage is both lower than the river corridor and lower than the carbon storage in the uplands in the subalpine portion of this basin. And we can look at a very different example going back to the Yukon. This is coming from Catherine Leininger's PhD work. Catherine looked at braided, anastomosing, and meandering parts of the river, and she was looking at individual floodplain units. So something like a channel fill versus a bar versus some of the many diverse types of wetlands there. And there's not huge differences between these individual channel units like we were seeing for the mountain catchment, but if you know something about the median values of carbon in these different channel units, as you can see just looking at this Google Earth image, you can map the distribution of those and use these median values, and this is what Catherine did, to come up with an estimate of total carbon stock in this river. And in this context, the whole area she was working in is essentially a wide, low gradient portion, but the Yukon changes as you go downstream. So Catherine's work was up here in the very extensive floodplain, but notice the planform of the river as you go downstream. The flow here is from right to left. The Yukon goes into It goes out of something like this in the floodplain reach, where there are a lot of floodplain wetlands, into something more like this, where there's essentially not a floodplain in places. It's uplands that come right down to the edge of the river. So again, much lower carbon stock in those portions of the river corridor or the watershed. So both field studies and extrapolations from the literature indicate that not all portions of a river network or a river corridor are equally important for storing carbon. And I've started referring to these as beads and strings. This comes from work by Jack Stanford in the 90s. Jack Stanford's a stream ecologist who did a lot of his work in Montana. And an illustration of this. So this is North St. Vrain Creek again. And in the lower part here, you're seeing the same beaver meadow that I've showed you photos of before. A string is those steep, laterally confined or narrow portions, transport dominated. There's just not much floodplain, not much place to store carbon. The beads are the wide, low gradient portions, and Jack Stanford came up with this term because on a map or an aerial image, they look like beads on a string if you look at the whole length of the river. And there have been different approaches to comparing beads and strings. People have looked at biogeochemical cycling, nutrient dynamics, particularly nitrate or nitrogen. They've looked at biological productivity, so habitat abundance and diversity, biomass and biodiversity. We've looked at carbon. All of these different lines of evidence indicate that the beads are very, very important. They provide a lot of storage and biogeochemical processing. They provide a tremendous amount of habitat and really support much of the diversity in the river ecosystem. And they are the major areas for carbon stocks and river networks. So as I mentioned earlier, there's more surface area, there's more depth, there's a higher organic carbon concentration. There are also places where transport capacity declines. They are depositional environments, both for mineral sediment, but also for large wood. So depending on the context, if you don't have beaver, for example, you may still have a lot of carbon stored in the form of persistent floodplain log jams that are formed during very high flow when the floodplain is inundated and transport capacity is greater. So to put this in the context of a budget, you can look at the carbon budget for an active channel and for the floodplain portion of a river corridor. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to make the point that I don't think most people would say this, but I can say it about myself. I'm sort of taking a caveman approach to carbon in river corridors in the sense that I'm just looking at how much carbon is stored in the floodplain soil and the large wood. I'm not looking at anything with carbon isotopes, with reaction times, reactivity, the sources of the carbon, or what happens to it when it's no longer stored. But I'm very cognizant that those different reactions are important. So looking at the active channel, you can have storage in large wood, in particular dissolved organic carbon or in aquatic biomass. Looking at the inputs, those can be coming in from the uplands or from the adjacent riparian and floodplain. You can have inputs in both the surface and subsurface of organic carbon and carbon dioxide gas. And then there's net primary productivity in the channel. So this would be algae or rooted aquatic macrophytes like water lilies or rushes and sedges. You also have outputs. There's carbon dioxide going back to the atmosphere. It's coming directly off the water surface or from organisms in the water. And of course, there's carbon going downstream, either to the ocean or laterally out to the floodplains. If we look at the floodplains, there's carbon storage in large wood, the soil carbon that I've been emphasizing, and above ground biomass, the living plants. There's inputs from the uplands, from the channel in the surface and subsurface, and net primary productivity is particularly important in floodplains, especially forested floodplains. And then there's losses, again, through soil and plant respiration to the atmosphere, and then in the surface and subsurface going back into the channel. So there's, of course, tightly coupled feedbacks between the active channel and the floodplain and between the larger watershed, the atmosphere, and ultimately downstream to the ocean, going back to that idea of rivers as pipes. So Luca mentioned my interest in management and communicating with people who are not scientists. I think there's an opportunity that's rapidly developing for those of us who are geomorphologists and hydrologists to become involved if we're interested in efforts to sequester carbon. And in my part of the United States, for example, there's a history of carbon mitigation banking with upland afforestation or reforestation, so putting carbon into forests or allowing the forest to take up carbon. There's also a history of carbon mitigation banking in terms of wetland restoration. And within the last 2 years, there's kind of a flurry of discussion among different government agencies and practitioners who do river restoration of, oh, can we start to have carbon mitigation banking using river restoration in floodplains? And I think we can. It's not going to be simple or straightforward, but I think we have the potential to identify portions of a river network where you can sequester a lot of carbon, such as the floodplain wetlands you're seeing in that upper photo from the Yukon, and design management, such as the very newly installed beaver dam analogs that are in this lower photo that they look better after the vegetation comes back. But we can start to design management to enhance carbon sequestration. And I'll use the South Platte River as an example. The North St. Vrain Creek that I've been talking about is a headwater tributary of the South Platte. It would be, if you can see the cursor, somewhere around there. The larger watershed is ultimately tributary to the Mississippi via several other rivers, but something like 67,000 square kilometers. The map you're looking at here, the different colors indicate different stream orders from the first order to the ninth order of the main stem. And this lower map, the elevation bands are indicated in different colors. So this is based on work that Rich Knox, who was a former PhD student who's now at West Point, did. He used the software GF Plane, which was developed by Nardi and others, to map the hydrogeomorphic 100-year floodplain. And then we have a history, my grad students and I, of working in this catchment. So we have a lot of field data that we could use to constrain the reasonable estimates of floodplain soil carbon. We just focused on soil organic carbon in different parts of the network. So what you're looking at here in the different elevation bands, and for the montane and subalpine zones, we divided them into beads and strings, then the proportion of the total floodplain area that's in those. And the key here is that the steppe, or the shortgrass prairie, is the vast majority of this catchment. The next column is the median values of carbon, and we did sensitivity analysis where we use different values, but this is what we think is the best estimate. I've bolded the subalpine beats, so those areas that we were looking at earlier in the Google Earth view, they have by far the greatest carbon per unit area, but the steppe is the vast majority of the basin. So for carbon stock at the basin scale, that steppe environment at lower elevations is really important. It looks something like this. The black is the steppe environment. So if you're focused on trying to enhance carbon sequestration using river restoration and management, I think it would be foolish to neglect these semi-arid grasslands. They may not have as much carbon per unit area, but they're a huge area. If you really want to get the most effect per unit area, though, focusing on the montane and the subalpine makes more sense. And the one thing I'd emphasize with this is that if you're restoring a river corridor in a way that enhances carbon storage, you're connecting the channel and the floodplain hydrologically and geomorphically, you're promoting that high water table that creates the saturated reducing conditions, you're getting all those other benefits. So you're getting nitrate removal, phosphate storage, flood attenuation, sediment storage when you have very high sediment fluxes, such as after wildfire or landslide, more biomass, more biodiversity. You get a lot of benefits when you're trying to restore for carbon. So one of the reasons that it's, I think, appropriate to think about restoring carbon storage or carbon stock in rivers is because of what we as humans have done. We've mostly decreased terrestrial inputs. We've changed land cover, and we've done everything we can to stabilize the uplands so we don't have landslides. There's less carbon coming into the floodplain from the channel because we've reduced overbank flooding through lots of different mechanisms, levees, flow regulation, removing naturally occurring obstacles like the Great Raft, which is a historic wood raft in Louisiana. There's less carbon storage on the floodplain because we've changed the saturated reducing environments to unsaturated oxidizing environments. There's a big drainage canal in the photo here from the Illinois River. We may have created more carbon storage in reservoirs. I say may because you notice that bullet that just appeared says storage in and emissions from. There have been a series of studies in the last 5 years that have shown that artificial reservoirs actually emit a lot of methane and carbon dioxide. So it's still an open question as to whether reservoirs around the world are primarily sequestering carbon or returning it to the atmosphere. It depends on things like the geometry of the reservoir, the sedimentation rate, the water temperature, and the overturn time. So some reservoirs probably are carbon sinks, others are more carbon sources. But certainly the net effect is that all of the different ways we've altered watersheds and river corridors have almost certainly reduced carbon storage. There are very few studies that have examined this explicitly. One of the most complete was this one that was published several years ago, where Hanbury and others, and Hanbury is, I think, a plant ecologist, looked at the lower Mississippi alluvial valley, and they inferred conditions at the time of European settlement, so something like the 1700s. They looked at carbon stored in living riparian vegetation and in floodplain soils, and 98% loss. That's very substantial. There are a few studies that are starting to compare more altered and less altered river corridors. Catherine Leininger and Lena Polvey, for example, have done this work in Sweden, and they've shown that those more anthropogenically altered river corridors do have less floodplain carbon in the soil. So we've altered things in a manner that tends to reduce carbon storage. That's one of the reasons to start to focus on restoration and management that can restore some of this carbon. So the management implications, I would say, figure out which watersheds and where in a watershed can you get the most organic carbon storage. You're probably going to get a lot of resilience to disturbance also. Identify the processes that really create and sustain the beads. Mostly the processes that create the beads are geologic, but those that sustain them may be things like having channel mobility as opposed to artificially stabilized banks, having overbank flow that inundates the floodplain, having naturally occurring obstacles like large wood and beaver dams. So trying to restore those. So either protect or restoring those processes, both the indirect, and then the indirect would be restoring natural processes directly. Well, if you want lots of log jams in a catchment that's had deforestation, you may not want to wait 200 years before, which is the estimated time in many parts of the world for woodloads to restore themselves to natural levels. So maybe you have intervention, you have engineered log jams or deliberate reintroductions of wood, as an example. And I think the key thing is reconnecting channels and floodplains. That can really restore floodplain wetlands and dramatically increase carbon storage. This is a very natural channel in the upper part of Rocky Mountain National Park, with a nice beaver dam in the foreground. So that all hopefully sounds good and makes sense, but there are some pretty important questions of how many of these and where should you put them? What's the most effective in a watershed? What kinds of scaling do you need to really have a noticeable influence? So when I think about rivers anywhere in the world, historically, they had a lot of floodplain wetlands, lots of those beads. So maybe they look something like this. Now, maybe more like this. There's a few left. So the question is, what should we focus on in future? The headwaters and upper portions of networks and the lower portions, and this is very much an open question, but some of the research we've been doing in Colorado in particular suggests that the uplands are disproportionately important, which can be nice because if you're working on smaller channels, usually you've got a less complicated regulatory or ownership situation. There's fewer landowners that you have to deal with if you're working on individual small channels. So I hope that when you look at a river corridor like this, you'll think about those three-dimensional fluxes and the different places where organic carbon stock is being showed. That one brown swath is supposed to indicate riparian vegetation and soil, and think of that as an integrated whole of a river corridor. And clearly rivers are not neutral pipes. They're very complex environments, they're ecosystems. They strongly influence what happens to the carbon that comes into them from the terrestrial environment. And just to emphasize that point once more, I'm just going to zoom in quickly on a headwater stream in southern Colorado. If I go back for a minute, you can see there's beads there, but you zoom in and there's a lot of carbon storage in those wetlands that are all being created by beaver in this particular example. So there are different sources of organic matter and organic carbon inputs to rivers. Again, I said I'm ignoring the biochemistry, but there are different fractions of dissolved and particular organic carbon. They have different reactivities, so they move or are stored in different ways, and there's a nice opportunity for us as geomorphologists to interact with biogeochemists here. There are definitely big differences in the potential for storing carbon or exchanging it both within a river network, as I've showed for North St. Vrain Creek, and certainly among river networks, the boreal versus the tropics, or headwaters versus lowland rivers. But I think the point I want to leave you with is that rivers are very, very active pipes, and hydrology and geomorphology matter a lot in terms of what happens to the carbon that enters the freshwater network. We need to understand that valley context through the geomorphic context, the disturbance regime, how biota are influencing that, how changing climate may alter things in future, how our activities are influencing all of these. And we need to do this in the context of the potential for carbon sequestration in river corridors. So we need everything at this point. We need more basic field data. We need better conceptualizations, and ideally we'll move towards numerical simulations that give us predictive capability of, all right, if you restore X proportion of a watershed in the river network, you'll get Y amount of carbon sequestration. But I think, again, it's a potential for our community to engage in things that other scientists have been working on for quite a while in terms of organic carbon sequestration and climate change. So if you have ever heard of RED, it's the idea of allowing or actively replanting upland forest to reduce carbon. I started playing around with river corridors and I came up with RARE. So we go from the ultimate or the worst urban channel to the picture on the right, which is actually a channel in the middle of Toronto. That is also an urban channel, but they've got a green belt along it. They've got floodplain. I took this photo at very low flow, but there's large wood in there. There's hydrologic connectivity with portions of that floodplain, and you can see there's a lot of riparian vegetation. So hopefully we can continue, as we have been for a while now, moving more towards the scenario on the right. And I'd just like to thank all of the grad students who have contributed to this work over the years. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alan. It was wonderful. Let me see. We are now in a webinar setup and not the usual meeting setup, and that's all my fault. But you can write your questions in the chat. And if you want to ask your questions live, you can also raise your hand. And I don't think, well, we could promote you to panelist if you want to be seen. But if the audio is fine, we can just switch on your microphones. And we have already a few questions in the chat. So should we start right away? I think so. So Alan, what we will do is that we will read them to you so that everyone, whether or not you can see the chat, is on the same page. And so we'll start with a question by Marie Savina, who is wondering, what do we know about methane and CO2 release from the high water table in the reducing conditions in floodplains? Does the living vegetation compensate for these releases? I'm thinking about the analogy to artificial reservoirs and their ambiguous source or sink status.
Excellent question. Hi, Mary. Yes, I feel like everything I say, I just need to start with is it's complicated. So this is a big question right now in the Arctic, because with climate warming, beavers are moving farther north as the tree line or the woody vegetation advances. And there's been a couple of high profile papers saying, oh, but that means there's more methane going to the atmosphere. This is a problem. Using beaver ponds as an example, what people have shown is that there is a high methane release when you flood an area. That methane release is lower if it was historically a beaver pond. So even if it's been dry for a while, and I don't begin to understand or know much about the biochemistry of that, but if the soils were previously flooded, there's less methane release. And regardless, the methane release declines quite substantially over the first 4 years. So if I extrapolate from that to re-wetting floodplains that have been dried through anthropogenic activities, in some cases for a century or two, there is certainly going to be methane release. I have yet to see a comprehensive carbon balance for this. It's an important thing, I think, to be done. But as you point out, there's should be a dramatic increase in biomass if you're re-wetting the floodplain in terms of growing plants of various types, from sedges and rushes to potentially woody vegetation. That will be taking up carbon. And any plant litter coming out of those plants is much more likely to be preserved in the sediment because of the reducing conditions. So I realize I'm biased, but my guess would be that it will be a net carbon sink, even though you're creating new wetlands and there's some methane flux associated with those. But I have, as I said, I've yet to see a comprehensive carbon balance. I've been asked this question multiple times because if you're not in the United States, you may not be aware of this, but there's a huge effort to either mimic beavers with beaver dam analogs or to reintroduce beavers. And there's various reasons people push back against that, but one of them is concern about what will happen with the whole carbon balance. So for anyone listening who is looking for an intriguing and important research topic, go for it.
Thank you, Alan. Maybe I ask Michal or Boris to ask the next question.
Sure, I'll go ahead. I'll jump ahead. We have our next question from Rosalie Ardent, and she thanks you for the talk. And the question is regarding the suggestion to use this ability by river, especially floodplains, to sequester carbon and be possibly used in wetland banking. What do you think about the preeminence of the storage? Are these stocks of carbon, or can they really be permanent sinks and thus compensate for fossil carbon? Because in carbon accounting, we always try to differentiate between biogenic and fossil carbon.
Yes. Once again, rather than saying it's complicated, I'll say it depends. They are biogenic carbon in the sense that much of the material is either deposited from organic material being transported by the river, or is what the ecologists call autochthonous. It's plant litter from vegetation growing on the floodplain, but they are also fossil or petrogenic carbon if it's coming in with sediment from the uplands. So it's multiple sources. How permanent it is depends a lot on the setting of the river. For example, think back to North St. Vrain Creek, that floodplain turnover time of 1,500 years in the subalpine portion, 600 years down in the montane. So it depends on how large the floodplain is, how mobily or how laterally mobile the channel is, what kind of turnover time there is from channel avulsion or I'd say lateral migration, and other disturbances that might strip the floodplain. So if you're talking about the distal portions of the floodplain in the lower Amazon, the residence times there can be 10,000 years. If you're talking about a much smaller floodplain, it can be lower. So yeah, permanent is in the eye of the beholder, I think. It really depends on the geomorphic context and disturbance regime.
Right, so the next comment is from Wendy Brewer. Public lands in Central Oregon tend to be all upland, and the valley are privately owned and farmed. So those upland areas offer most of the opportunities for restoration activities. There seems to be a lot of potential for carbon storage in these areas, despite being very small geographically. Is my understanding of that situation correct?
Yes, those fairly small, well, you're talking about both uplands and lowlands here, but when you ask about a lot of potential for carbon storage, I'm assuming you mean smaller channels and floodplains. And yes, there is a lot of potential for carbon storage. The cumulative impact of the headwaters, remember 70 to 80% of the total channel length in any river network is in those first and second order channels. Downing and others showed that in a nice paper back in 2012 that was looking at river networks globally. So the cumulative effect of restoring or protecting those small floodplain beads in the smaller channels, I think is extremely important.
And I have actually almost a follow-up question by Mike Kirkbeek, who thanks you for the stimulating talk. Thinking about the maybe upstream area for the rivers, you have shown that the majority of carbon is stored on hill slopes, though at low density. Should we be focusing on retaining and enhancing this hillside carbon, at least as much as carbon in the river corridors? Yes,
I mean, I don't want to say that any part of our world doesn't deserve attention and protection. So, of course, I guess what I'd say, Mike, is that in places where the hill slope instability has been increased by human activities because of deforestation, for example, various changes in land cover. There's already, in many cases, a lot of work going into trying to stabilize those hill slopes because of the hazards associated with mass movements. But certainly from a carbon perspective, yes, having more natural disturbance regimes. I mean, we're never going to stop all landslides or hill slope instability. That would be stopping geomorphology. But we can try and mitigate some of the things that our activities have exacerbated, such as changes in land cover, exacerbating hill slope instability.
Thank you. I also see that Wendy Brewer, who asked a question about the relative importance of this upstream domain that's publicly owned in Oregon, is a fish biologist, and she is focused on stream restoration. So she wanted to add that as a context to her question. Maybe I'll let Michelle take up with the next question.
Sure. I think the next question from Anne McDonald also continues with the urban carbon sequestration. And she thanks you for the wonderful talk and asks, do you have sense of whether urban hydrology fundamentally would change the patterns of carbon flux that you've illustrated? And then she's giving an example from Portland, Oregon.
Yes, I think so, because one of the things, of course, that happens with urban hydrology is you get flashier systems. So you would have less chance for maintaining a high water table in the floodplain. You'd have less chance for overbank deposition of any organic matter moving with the river. You would have more erosive energy that would probably limit floodplain stability. You would change, depending on whether the river was completely within the urban area. Of course, you'd change any terrestrial carbon fluxes. I think you would mostly cut them off by paving areas. So, yeah, I'm chuckling because people have accused me of this as though it's a problem. I always look for the most natural, pristine, remote areas I can find to work in for a variety of reasons. So I have not done anything with carbon in urban rivers, but thinking through those different processes, I can't imagine it would be anything but a huge decline in carbon storage in urban rivers. But that's where putting in room for rivers programs, inset floodplains, natural recharge areas could really reverse a lot of those trends, I think, and start to make or create a little bit more carbon storage in urban river corridors.
Right, so we still have questions coming, so I will take the next one. Thank you, Hélène, for your awesome and super informative talk. So 2 questions. How does permafrost thaw along the river bank impact the carbon connectivity and carbon exchange between river channel, river bank, and floodplains? And then, can such permafrost disturbances be reflected in lateral carbon fluxes like in Yukon rivers?
Yes, that is an area of very active research. There's something called the Arctic Rivers Observatory, where they've been monitoring different fluxes from rivers of the North American Arctic and Siberia primarily. And they've shown some pretty striking changes as a result of changing climate. The big concern in much of the permafrost region is that the permafrost is degrading as the climate warms. And it's multiple influences. The air temperature is getting warmer, but also there's a change in wildfires that can change the cover and the thermal regime of the permafrost. So the short version is permafrost is degrading quite rapidly. That is creating these, I think of it as microbial big parties. They're having enormous microbial blooms in many of these Arctic rivers. The microbes are like, oh, carbon coming out of everywhere. And, they're processing that carbon. There are more CO2 and methane fluxes going into the atmosphere. There's also more going into the ocean because the microbes aren't consuming it all. So if you're interested in this, a few keywords in Google Scholar will bring up a lot of papers. It's a big concern and it's very detectable.
Fantastic. We have one more question that I see from Shengnan Zhou, who joins the crowd in thanking you for the great talk. And he asks if you see streambank erosion in your sites, and how do you think streambank erosion may affect the carbon storage and dynamics in river corridors? So I think, yeah, that's an interesting question, but maybe you could address more broadly in terms of the lateral dynamics in those river systems and how that affects the the budget.
One of the things that we've seen consistently in the rivers we work in is that the carbon concentration declines pretty dramatically with depth. And it appears to be mostly carbon that's coming from in situ riparian vegetation or litterfall on the surface, rather than fluvial transport and deposition. There are other rivers where people have shown that it's overbank deposition that matters, but for ours, it's the floodplain plants. So the age of the floodplain surface, wherever you're working, becomes very important. The longer the plants have been living there, dropping their litter, the higher the carbon concentration. So if you have, we absolutely see stream bank erosion at these sites. The 2013 flood in the North St. Vrain catchment was a particularly dramatic example. It was completely stripped the valley bottom in the Methane portion of the catchment. And the amazing thing was that Nick Sutphin had done work up there before that flood. So we had pre and post flood measurements, and it went from values of 90 to 100 micrograms of carbon per hectare to less than 10, because parts of the floodplain became a boulder field after that. It was a big depositional zone for those landslides. So the other thing I'd mention is in the subalpine portion, Nick found lower megagrams of carbon per hectare in the multi-thread reaches. These are anastomosing, they're not braided, so the rivers aren't super laterally mobile, but they are mobile. Those reaches had lower carbon stock overall than the wide low gradient reaches with just a single channel. So if you have a very dynamic river migration rate, for example, that will definitely decrease the carbon content.
Thank you. Maybe we are already close to 5 p.m. here in Europe, so maybe we have time just for the last 2 questions in the chat.
Sure. Our next question is a more active one, in the sense that it asks about sampling strategy. And Tanya asks, what would be your sampling strategy with large and multiple geomorphic units, channel bars more than 10,000 square kilometers, floodplain pockets, and such?
10,000 square kilometers. Yeah, I have worked in the Himalaya. That is a different scale. Well, what Nick Sutphin pioneered, and then what Catherine Leininger also used in the Arctic, was to treat individual patches on the floodplain. So channel fill, point bars, channel bars, etc., as patches that had a consistent carbon content. And Nick used Monte Carlo simulations to estimate that you need at least 11 samples to adequately characterize any particular patch. So if you have a channel bar that's more than 10,000 square kilometers, that's probably developing through time, and I wouldn't treat the whole thing as a single patch, but I think you can think of it as depositional or geomorphic units. And if they're time transgressive over periods of hundreds of years to thousands of years, then you should definitely have a larger sample size to try and capture that variability. But if they're, I think, representing periods of years to decades or maybe a century of formation, it's probably safe to treat that as one individual patch.
So we do have a small clarification from Tanya. If she's saying it's 10,000 square meters, not kilometers. Okay.
I thought so, but yeah. Okay. I was like, well, there's some really big systems in the Himalayas.
And we have a last question from Shannon Lucas. Any information on trade-offs between tree removal required for restoration and increased floodplain connections for carbon sequestration?
Well, the short answer is no. I have not seen that, but the place to ask or to look for that would be some of the restoration that the U.S. Forest Service is undertaking in Oregon right now, because there are several sites where they're doing what's called stage 0 restoration, and they are taking down some of the adjacent upland trees and adding literally thousands of very large logs to the floodplain or to the river corridor. And I know they've estimated the carbon that's stored in that downed wood, but no, it's a good question, Shannon. I don't know of any studies that have addressed that directly. I guess just add one thing quickly. I think it would depend on how quickly the trees regrow. So if you're removing trees in a place where new ones will grow, such as the uplands, versus removing trees in the floodplain and replacing them with wetland vegetation. But I don't know of any quantifications.
Shannon, I think that Anne MacDonald suggests that you have a look at the South Mackenzie River.
Yeah, that is one of those stage 0 projects.
Yeah. And I think that we will all join Mariam Jiré, who's a student in geomorphology from Mali, in thanking you for your interesting talk. So everything will be posted on YouTube. And for those of you who are now watching this stream on YouTube, you can head to the Discord server if you want to post your questions and continue the discussion there. And once again, thanks a lot, Alan, for the great talk. I'm going to stop the recording right now, and we can finish like this. Thank you.